Welcome to the IAAC Literary Festival, where we feature award-winning authors. We have a really special author today, an incredible story, and a wonderful moderator. Let me welcome Eshani Surya, who will be moderating this session. Welcome, Eshani.
Thank you so much.
Is it okay, Eshani, if I just say a few words about you to the audience so they get to know you? I hope I don't make you blush. So, folks, Eshani is a writer. She's based in Greenville, South Carolina. Her writing has appeared in or is forthcoming in Catapult and Literary Hub, among other publications. Previously, she won the Ryan R. Gibbs Award for Flash Fiction from New Delta Review and was included in the 2017 and 2020 long lists for Wigleaf's Top 50 Short Fictions. She has received a Pushcart Prize nomination from Joyland and received a nomination for Best Small Fiction from Paper Tarts. Her work has been included in the Tiny Nightmares anthology, edited by Nat Skelly Nieto and Lincoln Michel, and Forward, 21st Century Flash Fiction, edited by Megan Giddings. Eshani serves as Flash Fiction Assistant Editor at Split Lip Magazine. She holds an MFA in Fiction from the University of Arizona and is currently at work on a novel and essay collection. Eshani, you're wonderful. And what makes you very special is you're a second-generation IAAC family member, because it seems your mother is a dancer and has been part of us.
Yes. So I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to follow in her footsteps and also to be here in this conversation.
Thank you, Eshani. So join me and let's welcome the star of the event, the author, Megha Majumdar. Megha, it is such a joy to have you here. And to the audience, what a joyful story Megha has turned out to be. She was born and raised in Kolkata, India. She moved to the United States to attend college at Harvard University. This was followed by graduate school in social anthropology at Johns Hopkins University. She works as an editor at Catapult and lives in our hometown, New York City. A Burning is her first book, and it was selected in the top 100 notable books of 2020 by New York Times. Welcome, Megha.
Thank you so much. It's really special to get to do this with the Indo-American Arts Council, especially because last year, or I think around this time, I was moderating an event for you. So this is really fun. And hi, Eshani. I'm so glad to have a chance to chat with you. I don't know if everybody watching this will know, but I had the privilege of working with Eshani on some writing of hers in my role as an editor. So this is really fun for me.
I know this is going to be such a special conversation because you have journeyed together. Eshani, I'm going to hand this program over to you to moderate. I'll step out, and the two of you can now have a really intimate conversation on this incredible book that Megha has written.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Well, I want to give everyone a look at that beautiful book. So I have it right here. And, I was so excited to read it and just get a sense of the amazing work you've been doing. Because I don't know if you remember, but we were in a workshop together, 4 years ago or something. And I think maybe you had part of maybe a chapter. So just to see the work turn into this amazing book that I just loved so much. And now my partner is reading, we're passing it around the house. So it's amazing. But I wanted to kind of get a sense maybe about how you have felt about the reception of this novel and how it intersects with how you came upon writing it and the idea of it, and just kind of that journey for you.
Yeah. I started this book from a place of just watching what was happening in India, following the news. Even though I live here in New York now, my parents are in Kolkata, and so I try to go home every year, which is not going to happen this year. But I feel really connected to where I grew up still, and just kind of watching what was going on and wondering, how do ordinary people make their way through this? How do people move forward when they're surrounded by systems and institutions that do not work for them? And on top of that, there's this kind of rise in this hatred-filled ideology, this ideology which seeks to govern who belongs and, who can live meaningfully in a certain place. So that's kind of where it began. And thank you for the reminder that we were in that workshop a long time ago. I love that. Sorry, I keep touching these. I got these new wireless headphones, and they feel to me like they're about to fall out, but I think they're fine.
They look very good. They look like an accessory.
Thanks, Eshani.
Yeah, well, that's a really kind of fascinating place to think about. Kind of being in these different worlds, like living here, but also being connected to Kolkata, and thinking about also kind of writing. And one of the things that I remember from that workshop is that you handed in, I don't know if it was a chapter of this or like an early draft, and one of the workshop members kind of said something about how like it wasn't the India that he had expected to read about, which I remember was like really frustrating for me, because I was like, well, the India in your mind might not be the same as like what's really happening. And so I'm just curious, has that been in some way like your experience at all with writing this and sharing this with other people? What's it like to be writing about an India that Americans may have in their mind but haven't necessarily experienced?
That's a great question. I think in the writing, I'm always, and I think you're thinking about this too in your work, I think we're always thinking about complexity, right? Like, how can we write fiction that feels true, and that, that holds truth on the page, even when, and especially when it pushes back against more simplistic or common ideas of what life in a certain place looks like.
Yeah.
And part of that for me was, thinking about the ways in which I really wanted to bring in space for humor and intelligence, and, for people to have this kind of daily creativity, because they are living in a place which often doesn't help them do things in an easy way, and I will be very glad if somebody picks up the book and feels that they have a different insight into what this place is, Yeah. But can I ask you how that worked for you? Like, how do you bring that kind of surprise and truth into your own work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I've really thought about as a writer is centering my experience in places that people wouldn't expect. So I'm writing a lot of, think about like suburban Connecticut, and in this essay collection, I'm thinking about, I'm kind of interested.
Sorry, Eshani, I'm just switching headphones.
Oh, no,
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm just kind of thinking a lot about how, like, what is the Connecticut that people think they know through like different TV and media, and then what is that experience like for me as a little brown girl, like living in the suburbs, but then also thinking about like what is the experience that I don't have. So yes, like I'm of a marginalized identity, but I'm also, come from a certain class background, like upper middle class. And so like, what would it mean to be a person of color who doesn't come from that class identity? And so trying, I think, to center my experience, but also be open to the reality that my experience is not the only experience in those spaces, which I feel like your book is also kind of doing, because you're thinking about these different perspectives, these different points of view in the novel. You're not just looking at this space from this one main character, although obviously her story is like very affecting as well. So kind of how did you think about that, I guess, those different points of views and how they come together?
This is something that I'm definitely still thinking through, but I felt that having these 3 points of view in this fictional world would help us see the world in a fuller way, and would kind of add dimension to the story. So that was something that I was very interested in, is, what other kind of parts of this world can we see if there are more characters who are primary characters? And then part of it was also, I wanted to clarify kind of through the text that this is one specific story set within this world, and anybody who wants to write about this world and this society, they might choose to follow totally different character, totally different set of concerns and worries and dreams. And so that specificity felt really important to me, like the more particular I can make it, the more I can clarify that this is not, some grand narrative about the society. This is following 3 particular people that I made up. And, that's kind of why I decided to go with the interludes in the book, which, again, for people watching, they are just these short chapters which follow a minor character for a page or two. And it felt like a good way to say, here are all of these other people that you can follow if you wanted to. I'm so curious about your novel. Are you doing like multiple voices in your book?
I actually am. So I'm in the really like early stages of working on this book, but I basically kind of decided to do the point of view of about, I guess she's 15 or 16, like a girl in suburban Connecticut. So it's not auto fiction, but it's kind of pulling from some of that. But then her brother being like 18 or 19 and working in the tech industry. And so just kind of how can those even couple of years make a difference? How can gender make a difference? Those kinds of things, but also their worldview. So basically they are working with these beauty products that also intersect with technology. And he kind of looks at it as like, I want to undermine the system of white beauty standards. And she looks at it as like, I want to be accepted by the standard of beauty standards. So I kind of want to think about how people can come at the same situation from these different perspectives as well, which I feel like is happening in A Burning as well, right? We've got this like centered the spark, the burning, but then how can people actually look at that and understand it in the context of their own lives, which I think feels really important to complicate these situations, because sometimes we can just kind of be like, whose side am I on? Like when we read the story in the media or something like that. So yeah, I'm like really interested as well in the idea of looking at different points of views, because I think they create a system as opposed to just one story.
Yeah, I am so fascinated by the premise of the novel that you're working on. And because we're both talking about voices, one thing that I would really love to ask you is, so you have these 2 central characters as well. What is your process for arriving at different voices for
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. And it was actually a question I was going to ask you, so I'm going to make you answer it afterwards. The voices in your novel are so distinct. So I'm writing in the third person. I think that helps a little bit because the voice of the narrator for me is also sort of this like analytical look at what's happening to both of these characters. But what is interesting is that I feel like for me, these characters are voices of different points in my life. Like when I was 14 or 15, I looked at the world in a certain way. And so I'm pulling at that version of myself to write that character's voice. But how it was this character is like 18 or 19, but I'd say probably more when I was like in my early 20s is sort of where I'm pulling that voice. And it's interesting because he's working in the tech industry, which I did for a couple of years in my early 20s as well. So kind of situating myself into that space, I think helps provide these different voices, which is kind of cool because I'm like, oh, they're all just sides of myself, and shows how we just change as people as well.
I love that. I love that you can think about different parts of your own history as like contributing to different characters. That is so cool.
Yeah, what about you? How did you achieve the really distinct, especially first-person voices that you have in this?
You know, it was a slow and kind of hard process for me. You know, a lot of the times I think I felt like I was writing the content, but I didn't have the voice yet. And then you have to kind of keep working away at it. One thing that I kept in mind is how do I allow these characters to have voices which come out of their own circumstances? So, you know, Lovely's voice, who's a character in the book, she is somebody who is trying to learn English, very much aware of how English holds the key to all of these doors, you know, to move ahead, to get better roles, to be able to audition for better roles. And so in her voice, I really wanted an English which holds some of that aspiration and struggle. And then the other character who was in the first person, who was the central character, I just tried to think about the ways in which her bodily experience of moving through the world was really important in the book. And so I needed her to be very attentive to, you know, for instance, if she is in a police station and somebody like grips her arm, what does that feel like, you know? So just to be attentive to things like that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I think Lovely's voice for me stood out a lot in this book, and I noticed that you used a lot of like gerunds, like ing verbs, and I thought a lot about how it felt like for Lovely things were always moving, like not stagnated, and then for Jeevan it was like she was so stagnated because she was in prison, and so that difference like felt interesting, even though I also feel like Lovely struggled due to her circumstances, kind of being stuck in certain roles as well. Do you feel like that speaks at all to what you're trying to do with the voices?
I love that reading. That is so beautiful. I don't think that really occurred to me, but I really love that reading.
I love that. And then kind of thinking about P.T. Sir, who's more in kind of a third person, like what made you make that choice?
Yeah, so P.T. Sir, you know, he's the school teacher who finds that he gets involved in the workings of this right-wing political party, and then he has to make these moral choices which grow more and more murky. Mm-hmm. And I felt that for this character, something that I resisted was writing a kind of flat villain. You know, I thought that would be not very interesting. And so I needed the reader to empathize with him and understand that, you know, he is forced into this position and he's starting from a place of trying to do something decent. But at the same time, you know, I wanted empathy, but I also wanted critical distance, and third person kind of gave me that. So that the reader could look at him and say, you know, how would I respond in this situation if it is a choice between somebody else's freedom and justice for somebody else versus comfort and gains for myself? Which one would I choose?
Yeah. And I think that P.T. Sir is a really complicated character, and I think you alluded to this. He's trying to make some positive changes. I mean, he talks about we need to help the teachers not just change the curriculum to something more like nationalistic, and that kind of almost felt to me like not a right-wing ideal, but more of kind of towards a leftist ideology, but then seems to not be able to move that forward based on sort of organization or the party that he's a part of. So I guess like would you consider this a political novel? I guess should be maybe my first question.
I think it definitely does have political stakes, and hopefully it responds in some meaningful way to real world concerns around, who has room to move forward in this society, who finds that opportunities are available to them, who is told that they have to remain in a certain place and that is how their life must be. So I think those are big questions, about questions of justice, moral action. How do we maintain a moral center in a very corrupt and difficult and unjust world? That's a question that was very interesting to me in this book. Yeah, but I don't know. I feel like there are so many expansive ways of thinking about what political fiction is, and that is also really interesting to me. Would you say that what you're working on feels like political fiction to you?
Yeah, I mean, kind of when you were just speaking on that, I was thinking about how I kind of go in with the idea that like all writing is political, or to not write is political, to not speak is political, to speak is political, right? And so I do think that probably anything that we're producing, particularly as people of color, is going to be a political statement in some way. I guess I think about my novel as thinking more about, I guess, companies and like social media and kind of the way that society in America is very aligned towards whiteness. But then as I say that, I'm like, well, that's political. I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about. We're talking about breaking up big tech in politics. We're talking about white supremacy or white supremacist ideals as well. So kind of going back to, I guess in a form, it is a political novel. But what I think is really fascinating about your book is that you go for it. Like, you're like, we're going to have a scene where we have people just talking about politics in the country, or we're going to create that space. Was that hard for you, like, to imagine that space?
That is such a sharp question. I felt that in much of the book, I hope that we're kind of circling around these ideas in a way that, fiction can do really well. And I hope that the reader is able to bring their own experiences and their own opinions to it and kind of know what's going on. But you're right that in some places, I felt that the characters would be having a pretty straightforward conversation. It would be hard to write a book which has political aspirations in some of the characters and not have them talk about politics at all. And I was interested in that space where people talk about, the intersections of education and nationalism. That felt really interesting in P.T. Sir's character. And, there's a scene where he's talking to a different character and lamenting how people want to go abroad and, they don't have this kind of nationalist fervor for helping their country and, serving their nation. And it has become much more individualistic among the students that he sees. And, that kind of thing is stuff that I heard growing up, and it felt true to the novel to have this character who begins from a place of wanting to serve and feeling the whole time that what he's doing is the right thing, that he's helping larger society in some way, and kind of growing more and more disillusioned with his students who don't seem to have that kind of sentiment. Yeah.
Yeah, so kind of within that answer, you spoke a little bit to how even though you had to do this imagining of what it might be to be in that room, because I'm imagining that maybe you haven't been in that room of those like political conversations, maybe you have, but that also kind of is drawing from some of the things that you heard when you were growing up and things like that. So I guess I'm always interested in what research looks like for a fiction writer then, because sometimes I feel like I can write fiction and just pull it out of my brain and it's there and I've like crafted the whole world. Maybe it's when I'm kind of getting more into my fantasy or sci-fi literary fiction kind of realm, it's a little easier for me to do that. But then there are times when research becomes so important. And I guess I'm curious, because you have a lot of characters from different backgrounds, like what did research end up looking for like for you?
That's a great question. A lot of research was around Lovely's character in this book. And I read ethnographies, I have a background in anthropology. And, for any fiction writers who watch this, I highly recommend reading ethnographies because, anthropologists are so attentive to texture and dialogue and really what lived experience feels like. And there are brilliant anthropologists doing work on Hijra communities like Vaibhav Sarya, Gayatri Reddy. And then a lot of it was also, reading good journalism, and following the news very closely around what was happening. Highly recommend reading the news. And then part of it was, putting onto the page observations and memories from growing up and just feeling like I needed to write about the stuff that I noticed. Like you have this relationship with a guava seller who sits at the end of your street. And then you might get on a train and there are, 5 people sitting in a seat meant for 3. And people operate in all of these ways, in all of these relationships, these webs of, connectedness. They make jokes with each other. And that sense of daily life was something that felt really important to the book too. Are you doing a lot of research around tech and beauty companies?
Not so much right now. I think I'm kind of in a place where I'm just really interested in putting down, again, like you're talking about, like those more individual experiences that people have in these systems. But I also have just watched The Social Dilemma, which I feel like everybody is watching, but it like totally was one of those moments where it kind of like blew open for me, like what does it mean to have an algorithm like in social media? And I think that's always like my pitch for research as well is I feel like sometimes we can not want to do research because it can kind of mess with the idea of what we're writing. So like an example for me is like one time I wrote this story and it was really Americentric point of view I was coming from because it was about Costa Rica, and I guess I made an assumption about healthcare there, and I wrote the story of like, oh, these characters don't have good healthcare, and then I went and I did the research and they have better healthcare than a lot of people in the US do, and I was like, okay, well, I gotta shift this story, and it opened it up for me to think about, first of all, like my biases, but also I think the story became a little more complicated when I was able to actually recognize what that world might look like. So I don't know if you had any experiences with that as well, kind of like research pulling you into a direction you didn't think it would take you into, but that may be being helpful, or maybe that's too specific.
I don't think I don't remember there being a point where research kind of went against what I was imagining. I think it helped me deepen it, though, in the way that you're talking about, to really think about the particulars of what a place looks like or how people might relate to each other. That was really helpful.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine that, especially, again, while you're looking at all of these different kind of places in one space, because then how do all those things intersect with each other as well? So yeah, very interesting. So I guess I kind of also want to delve into some of the themes that we were talking about earlier, because we were thinking about like politics, but also I think there's other themes in this book that maybe are deeper links between all 3 characters that are sort of our main characters. And one of them for me was fantasy, because I was thinking about how Lovely sort of has this fantasy life as an actor, which does come to fruition, but also still in some ways isn't kind of the life that she had hoped for. And sort of P.T. Sir's fantasy life as this politician. And then also even Jeevan kind of has these moments, especially before being in prison or being incarcerated, that she has this fantasy to be like middle class. And I'm interested, first of all, kind of how that term middle class, what that means to you, as I've been reading a lot about sort of casteism lately and trying to really understand that, because growing up in America, I think I encountered it on a less obvious basis. I didn't understand it as much because I wasn't as embroiled in a larger kind of Indian society. So I guess that's question number one. And then question number two is sort of like, what are you thinking about fantasy?
That's a great pair of questions. I was interested in, so I think, class in this society was very interesting to me, especially because a lot of what I saw growing up was this huge amount of change. Jeevan's character, for instance, came out of thinking about the rise of malls. When I was a kid, there weren't any malls. You went to stores, and it was a very different kind of shopping and retail landscape. And then we started getting these malls, and with those malls, you started getting people who are doing all sorts of different jobs in the malls. And then, for instance, food delivery is such definitely a newer category of employment, where you have all of these apps, and it gives all of these people employment where they can, have that work. And growing up, I observed that, a lot of these jobs allowed people to rise in a way that their parents perhaps hadn't been able to. And that rise was, it was met with, I think, a lot of hope, and that place of hope was really interesting to me, to write a character who doesn't have any giant political ambitions, is not sitting around thinking about her place in society, but wants very concrete things. She wants comfort for her parents. She wants to enjoy her new smartphone. And that place of aspiration is really powerful to me, where you can see that even though your parents had one kind of life, you are perhaps able to dream of a better life.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where Jeevan came out of. And fantasies. I love that you're putting it like that, because of course there's this element of aspiration in all of the characters, but you're right that there is this quality of something very far out of reach for some of them. And I think that provided, that was something concrete for the characters to hold on to, It's what do they want in this society? Because again, and I want to ask you about this, because you said you're working on both essays and a novel, so you're kind of going back and forth. But for fiction, I was thinking about, how the work of fiction is not done through polemic or, some kind of dry argument, but by really making the reader feel that they understand what a character wants, that they empathize with the character's hopes and dreams. And so that felt like a really concrete grounding of each character. And this is the big thing that they dream of.
Yeah.
How about you?
Well, I just want to say, I think that's a really interesting thing for Jeevan as well, because she is sort of in some ways the catalyst to so much of this, but she's also the one who wants the most normal life, out of this. She just wants to live, and you can't help but feel something about that, because for me, I'm like, wow, I go to work every day and I'm able to do that. But this character isn't able to, for a variety of structural reasons. And to me, that was so heart-wrenching, almost more heart-wrenching than anything else that she goes through, which sounds like a weird thing to say. No, obviously the other things that she goes through are so incredibly horrible, but maybe because that circumstance is so close to most of our circumstances, just wanting to live and survive and be relatively happy. Isn't that what most of us want? So yeah, I think that makes her really, really the central figure in this, because she is the one in some ways that we are all closest to too, I think, which is an interesting pull in her character. We both relate to her maybe the most, but also her circumstances take her in places that many of us may not experience as well. So really, really interesting there. But yeah, to go off kind of the question of, I guess, desire. And I think that's true. Like when we start writing, we're like, what does this character want? Like what is important to them? And I think that I can pinpoint that pretty quickly for my characters, because what's propelling them through this scene. Like for my 15, 16-year-old, she wants to be accepted. That's really, she wants to be accepted. And she wants also not only accepted, but to be seen as beautiful, to be seen as someone who can actually figure into the society in some like meaningful way. That's probably the way she would put it, not the way I would put it. But then, sort of her brother, like what he wants to do is see these systems undermined, like see equality and fairness as much as possible. So I do think that's important. And I think that's kind of important for me in essay writing as well. I mean, I think I write a little bit more on sort of the personal essay spectrum and a little bit less so on the heavily, heavily researched essay spectrum, although I'm kind of trying my hand at that a little bit more too. But I've always found that I'm most interested in the human story in an essay. I want to know how this affects who we are as people. Oh yeah, I mean, as an editor, did you kind of find that when you were editing people's essays? You edited my essays, so.
I think as an editor, I'm always asking, what does this piece want to do, and how can I help it get there? And I think that's one of the things that I ask really early on, which is, it's not so much about like, is this good? Do I love it? But also on top of that, like, do I know how to serve it? Thinking about, the books world, for instance, that's the kind of question that I ask a lot, because there are so many books that we love, but that we perhaps can't publish. And, it comes down to those questions of, do I know how to introduce it into the cultural conversation? Do I know what other books it's in conversation with? Do I know how to talk about it and how to pitch it and, that kind of stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, so I really love that question of like, what are we in conversation with? So I feel like when I first started off as a writer, I talked a lot about my influences, and I've changed that question more to who am I writing with, who am I writing against, and why? Because I think that idea of like, what are the traditions that we're interested in is more helpful than just that blanket term of influences. But for me, what's been sort of a shift is, like when I was like 15 or 16, actually, I didn't want to be like a cultural writer or an Indian writer. Like, I didn't want to like be the writer who only wrote about her culture. And now I'm like, well, for me, race is in everything I write, whether like I'm writing a character who's explicitly thinking about race, or if it's just like a piece of their experience in the world. And I also used to write pretty exclusively white characters, and now I write pretty exclusively brown characters, because I'm like, well, they can do anything that a white character can do, So I guess I'm sort of curious, like, for you, do you have a sense of what literary traditions you're interested in writing with or against, and like how you feel like maybe you're perceived in the world too? Like, do you find that people are always like, okay, well, like Megha's a South Asian writer, so let's compare her to all the other South Asian writers or something like that?
That's a good question. So I think that I see myself in conversation with who I read, and I am constantly reading a lot of contemporary fiction and nonfiction. And I feel like something that I really find very meaningful is reading with an eye toward, what can I learn from each book? What forms of complexity, storytelling, pace, movement, structure, openings, closings, what can I learn? What thrills me in somebody else's work, and what can I learn from that? And so that's a really fun kind of mode in which to read. And I have a couple books here actually that I really loved and that made me think this year. And one of them is called The Death of Vivek Oji by Afweke Mezi. Have you read this yet?
I haven't read it yet, but it's on my list because it looks fantastic. And now you're recommending it to me too.
It's so good. I really loved it. And then another is a book of short stories called A House is a Body by Shruti Swami. Really love these and highly recommend to anybody who's thinking about, what is contemporary fiction doing? What kinds of interesting things can we learn from it? How about you? What have you been reading and loving and learning from?
Yeah, so I actually kind of like took a nonfiction class recently. Like I actually took an intro nonfiction class just because I like thought it would be interesting to get down to the basics. And so that's been like really, really, really fun. But I guess I've been trying to pick up things that are a little bit like working sort of in a speculative or fantasy world as well, because I'm really interested in that. So wait, let me roll over to my bookshelf. So dropping things. But I really like Naomi Novik's books actually, which is like, I think very different than some of the books that we're talking about, because it's pretty much like a YA fantasy is the way that a lot of people read it. But I'm like so invested in how we tell compelling stories. And I think that's something that you do here too. Like you're interested, it feels, in moving the plot forward, because I'm kind of like, I feel like it can be hard sometimes in the literary fiction world. We feel like the story moves so slowly, and sometimes you're just trying to grasp like what's happening. And I feel like that's such an initial thing that you learn about writing. Like something has to happen to these characters, but sometimes I feel like we lose that in literary fiction. I mean, do you feel that way ever?
I think people have strong opinions on, plot and movement and that kind of thing. And I have found that I really enjoy a good plot. I really enjoy a book that moves, a book that knows where it's going. Which is not to say that I haven't loved books which linger and have a different kind of intention. I've loved such books too, but I do think that especially crafting a compelling plot, writing a book in a way where there's a sequence of events, there's some kind of escalation, let's say, or, there's something that keeps the reader turning the pages and wondering, well, what's going to happen in the next chapter? I think sometimes that's easily dismissed. And I don't know why that is, because I think it is incredibly hard to do.
I totally agree. I think Ocean Vuong's book, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, like does a really good job of what you're talking about, where it feels like a slower build, and it feels like the language is really what's pulling us through the pages, but I still feel like things are happening. I feel like those conflicts are escalating. So I feel like if anyone's looking for a book that is kind of doing a little bit of what you said, that might be a direction also to look in. But I know that we're kind of running a little bit low on time now, and I really want to ask you just, is there anything that I haven't brought up that you would love to say about this book or yourself as a writer, like where you're going next? Because I always I'm just curious what people are thinking about.
Oh, well, I am just really delighted that we've had this chance to chat, Eshani. I think you're doing some of the most exciting work out there. I think we will be very lucky when we get your novel and your essay collection, and that people should look out for your work. I mean, a bunch of your work is online already, so everybody watching, please Google and read Eshani's work. Yeah, I mean, this has been one of the great pleasures of this year, which, when the pandemic happened and my events were canceled, I didn't really know if I was, publishing the book into a void. And I've been really grateful for the chance to have these conversations. So thank you so much for your care and your generosity, Eshani.
Oh my gosh, thank you. You're so sweet. And I really feel you and all the people who've also been able to publish this year, like you are our anchors, I think, in this pandemic. Like I've just seen so many people be like, okay, this book is the thing that's getting me through this week, So I think that's amazing. And congratulations on your book as well. It's so beautiful. But let me bring Rakesh back into this conversation as well. I think he was hoping to say a few words before we all log off.
I have to say, Eshani and Megha, it was just such a joy to see the trust between the two of you. It was a beautiful duet as both of you explored the writer's craft. How does a writer make sweet music? Of course, the reader gets to hear and taste the end product, but there was a craft to it. And it was just a pleasure, Eshani, as you explored the various themes with Megha. I want to thank you, Eshani, and I have to say to you that Megha has whetted our appetite for your forthcoming novel, and certainly hope to see you within the IAC forum. And Megha, Destiny's Child, you have done so well with your debutante novel that we want to wish you great success in your journey ahead. And we are very proud that you're part of us. We look forward to many touch points as you bloom fully. And
thank you so much.
And thank you again. And stay safe. And we will continue our conversations in the future. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Neely Lakhani, IAAC Literary Festival Director. I want to thank you for joining our award-winning authors and their wondrous stories. IAAC is a 501c nonprofit. Programs like the one you just watched happen because of contributions from generous folks like you. Please donate to the IAAC so that we can support our artists and sustain our cultural programs. It is simple to donate by visiting the IAAC website at iaac.us. Learn about the insider benefits that membership gives you. On behalf of the entire IAAC board, stay safe and see you at our next event. Thank you.